They're nodding. Okay. Can the audience see me? Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you giving up a little time on your weekend. This is a topic that has become very important to me. And so I'm glad when anybody is interested and wants to hear this story. Please today, I would like this not to be so much a lecture as just a discussion. So jump in at any time, and I mean really any time, with questions or comments or observations. You can do that by typing into the chat room, or I think by raising your hand also. So, and then the other thing I want to say by way of introduction is that what I'm going to tell you about took place almost 2 years ago now, which is half a lifetime at least. Everything, a few months after I left El Paso, everything changed, completely 180 degrees polar opposite, upside down. So, and now it's kind of in the process of returning to kind of conditions when I was there. So keep in mind that things may have changed drastically since what I'm telling you about. My particular story began in January of 2019. I was listening to public radio, and 3 days in a row, there was a story that carried stories about this Catholic charity in El Paso, Texas, that was called Annunciation House. And they were receiving 700 to 750 refugees a day. And I just couldn't get that out of my head, and it just raised all kinds of questions. How could they take care of that many people? Where did they put them? How did they feed them? How, what kind of services could they give to 700 people a day? And then also, where were they coming from? And why were they coming in such great numbers right now? And why were we even calling them refugees? And then back to the original question, how were they doing this? Where were they putting these people? El Paso is a city about the size of Milwaukee. And I would say to myself, so in Milwaukee, could we do that? Would we do that? And I just was so curious. So I went to the website for Annunciation House and found that they have this original house here, which I call the mother house or the mothership, and then 2 more like it. And they had been housing refugees for, I don't know, 25, 30 years maybe. And then during that crisis in 2019, when there was such an influx, they also leased 2 motels. There were 2 empty motels that they took over. And I still kind of couldn't make the math add up. I have only learned just very recently that there were also about 30 parishes in the El Paso area that took in refugees. Not all the time. They took them in as they were able and as there was need. And the parishes, of course, had most of them had kitchens with them, and many of them had either like a big gym or a big community room. So that's where they could house some of the people. So I just kept thinking about this, and read the story about Annunciation House, what their mission was and everything. And so a couple weeks later, I guess, I got in touch with the volunteer coordinator there. Woman's name was Mary, and she was wonderful. She would always, no matter what was going on, no matter how busy they were, she'd always get back to you within 24 hours. And I asked her if they could use a Spanish-speaking nurse. And Mary said, "Oh, we are so swamped. Yes, we could use all the volunteers we could get. Any help is very much appreciated. And if you speak Spanish, so much the better, because really none of our clients speak English. But we don't need a nurse." And I thought, wow, that's crazy. Everybody needs a nurse. But Mary said, no, the people that come to us are mostly pretty healthy. Some of them have coughs and colds and things like that. But if they're really sick, very rarely we'll have somebody that's really sick and we take them to the doctor. So we don't need a nurse would become a running joke in a few weeks. I couldn't really know that then. So I started making arrangements to go there for the flight and then for a place for me to stay. And then I had to do a background check, which was very reassuring to me because I would be working with a lot of kids. And at that time, they were asking volunteers to stay for a month at a time, a month at a minimum, so that you would get to know their system. And so I thought, okay. And then when I was about to buy my plane ticket, I got an email from Mary, all in caps, saying, "Don't come now. We don't need you now. We're down to about 100 guests per day, and we can easily serve them with just the volunteers that we have in the El Paso area with our local volunteers. If you've already bought your plane ticket, go ahead and come. We'll try and find something for you to do. But keep in mind, there are a lot of people here from out of state who are just twiddling their thumbs." And I thought, wow, so strange. But Mary asked if they could keep my name on like an on-call kind of waiting list. I said, sure. So a couple weeks later, Mary emailed me and said, "Can you come now?" And I said, "No, I can't come now. I'm on my way to Mexico to follow the migration of the monarch butterflies. I will try and come in April if I can." April came and I had some family medical emergencies, couldn't go. So finally in May of 2019, I thought, if I don't go there now, I will never get there. And at that point, they were, again, very desperate for volunteers. So they said, they asked for a minimum of 2 weeks so you could get to know their system. And I had 3 weeks that I carved out. So once you commit to being a volunteer there, they send you a little more information. They ask you to choose a shift, either from 8 in the morning till 2 or from 2 in the afternoon till 10. But they said, if we have arrivals at any time, drop what you're doing, please, and come out to welcome the new arrivals. And please be willing to do any kind of work. Anything that needs to be done by the closest person. So don't stand on ceremony. So that sounded fine. They also told me that the night that I got there, apparently most people arrive in the afternoon. So they said, the first night that you're there, don't do any work, just observe and learn about our system, again, about this system. And they also said to me that at least 24 hours before I left home, they would let me know which of the buildings I'd be working in, and they would try to have somebody meet me at the airport. So I set out for El Paso one morning, having no idea which building I was going to be working in. Thought that maybe I would go to the main house, and if they wanted me someplace else, they could either send me or take me someplace else than the mother house. And when I got to Dallas, I had a stopover and I got a text from them saying, "You will be working in Casa del Refugiado, House of the Refugee." And I texted back and said, "Well, that's fine. Please give me an address or a phone number or something." And they gave me both. And I asked if there would be for sure room for me to stay there. And they said, "Oh yeah, there'll be plenty of room for you to stay there." And I asked if there would be somebody to meet me at the airport. And they said, well, not sure. So from that, I gathered that there would not be anybody to meet me at the airport. So I arrived down in the West Texas town of El Paso. And it looks pretty much like that. And of course, there was no one to meet me there. So I took the first cab in the lineup, and I could not know at that time that I would be the beneficiary of a lot of blessings during those 3 weeks. A lot of people would become my allies. A lot of strangers would do kind things to me. And I couldn't have done the work that we did without help like that. So my cab driver's name was Miguel, and he was the first blessing who came my way. Miguel drove me, I handed him this address and he plugged it into his GPS. And as we were driving, he said, "This is way out on the edge of town." And I said, "Oh." And then he said, a little while later, that's kind of a industrial park. And I said, oh. And he said, yeah, there's not much out there. And I said, oh. And I could see that he was very gently and very courteously trying to find out what a woman of a certain age alone was doing, going out to this industrial park after business hours with one little suitcase. And I didn't know how much I should reveal to him, though. I thought, I've worked in border towns before. I've worked with big migrant communities before, and local people do not always welcome them because they put quite a strain on the local economy, on the local infrastructure, um, specifically the hospitals and sometimes the schools and the law enforcement. Even traffic patterns change and things. And I didn't know how people would feel about having all these migrants come in. So I was a little reluctant to talk to him, but it was clear that he really wanted to know what I was doing there. So I finally said, well, I'm going to be a volunteer in a shelter for refugees. And he broke into this big grin. He was smiling from ear to ear. He said that he had worked in a shelter, and he used the English word boys. He had worked in a shelter for boys. He may have meant children, I'm not sure. The entire month of January. And it was such a good experience for him. First of all, he got paid a lot better than driving cab. So that was helpful. But also, he said, we really tried to create a family atmosphere for those boys. We played soccer with them, and we established regular meal times and regular bedtimes. We made sure they went to bed on time, and we tried to make sure that they would eat their vegetables and brush their teeth and stuff. We tried to be a family to them. So he thought this was a very good thing that I was doing. So we arrived at this address, and it does not look very inviting or very welcoming. What with the chain link fences and the barbed wire and everything. And I couldn't even find a door. I couldn't figure out where to go in. And so we sat there for a few minutes, and Miguel's kind of looking at me, wondering what to do next. And then some ladies came out of this door, and they were laughing and chatting, and they went to their car, 4 or 5 women. And I ran up to them and I said, I'm a new volunteer. And they said, oh, well, just go in the door there. And yeah, and they didn't say anything more. They got in their car. So I walked in, and I met another person who was a blessing to me, Pastor Paul, the Presbyterian. He said, oh, if you're a new volunteer, I'll take you to the office. So he led me down these corridors. I forgot to leave a trail of breadcrumbs, unfortunately. And I think we walked about a half mile. And there were all these industrial eye wash stands and sinks and I don't know, corners and vents and things. And I finally got to the office. The young woman on the right in the striped shirt there, her name is Krista, and she was the manager. At that time, she was 24 years old. And I cannot tell you how much respect I have for this young woman. She was so focused and so energetic and so clear-headed and compassionate, and she had a sense of humor. And I don't know where she got the energy, but anyway, so she was managing this whole place. And she said, oh, so you're a new arrival. I bet you'd like a tour. And I said, sure. And so she left the office, opened the door to the office, and about 9 people descended on her. And they had all kinds of, excuse me, miss, I'm sorry to bother you, but pardon me, miss, excuse me, miss. Everybody had a request for her, and she kind of gently put them all off for a little bit. And she led me a few steps away, and she said, this is chaos. We try to control the chaos, but it's chaos. And she led me over to the dormitory, just a few steps away. And she held out her arm and she said, this is Ellis Island. Welcome to Ellis Island. And I thought, my goodness, this is Ellis Island. This is what it looks like in a different place, of course, but 120 years later, this is the new Ellis Island. These people came here for the same reasons and seeking the same things. And I'm right in the middle of Ellis Island. And I never had that out of my mind the whole time I was there. And I think about it all the time now. This is what Ellis Island was like. Um, and about that time, somebody else came up to Krista, probably 10 other people, and they needed more things and they had more requests and she had to leave. So that's the only tour that I got. Was just a few steps over to the dormitory. But somebody came to me just then and said, "Hey, are you hungry?" And I said, "Oh, I sure am." And they said, "Well, you're too late for supper. You missed out on supper." And at that point, another volunteer just recently arrived, showed up. And so this person said, "Well, I've got some cold rice and some cold pasta." And Barbara said, "Oh, I would love the cold rice." And I said, "I would love the cold pasta." So we went and sat in the dining room, this big kind of industrial dining room, and ate our cold rice and ate our cold pasta and talked about where we were from and our families and this and that and how we got there. And then we both jumped up and I found a push broom and she found some rags and some cleaning solutions and we started cleaning the dining room. Because there were, I suppose at this time, 450 people a day in the House of the Refugee in Casa del Refugiado. Maybe at least half of those were kids. And so there was a lot of spilled milk. There was a lot of Cheerios on the floor. There were wrappers everywhere and we didn't want vermin. So we had a big cleanup job to do after every meal. So Barbara and I set about that. But then Krista, or somebody came back to me and said, "We need you to work in the clothing bank." And I said, "Okay." And they took Barbara to work someplace else. So we worked a few hours. And then Krista came and got me about 10 o'clock or 10:30 that night and said, "I'd like you to show you to your room before it gets too late. And oh, by the way, we don't have indoor plumbing." And I said, "Oh, well, that's okay." And so she showed us where the porta potties were. Took me to my room, which if you're familiar with the community room in the Menomonee Falls Library, my room was that big. And all I had brand new carpeting, brand new paint job, but I had a twin bed mattress. That's all. No furniture, no windows. Just I had this huge empty room with a twin bed mattress in it. And I had that for the entire time that I was there. So I went to sleep that night and I should tell you something very personal about me. I sleep in a scrub suit, a hospital scrub suit. That's my pajamas. So um, I got up the next morning and I went out to find the porta potties. And the only way I knew how to get to the porta potties was through the dormitory at that time. I didn't know any shortcuts. And so I stumbled out there in my hospital scrub suit and my flip-flops, and a woman came running up to me and said, "Please, you've got to help me. Please, my baby is sick. Please help my child. My child is so sick." And of course, who can turn down an appeal like that? But I mean, I didn't even have my glasses on or anything. And I said, "Okay, I was on my way out to the bathroom. Let me take care of that. And then I'll meet you here at the clinic, which is part of the dormitory. And I'll be back in a couple of minutes." So I went and got the master key. The child was 4 years old. She had her cheeks, I'm sure, were brighter than mine. It looked like she maybe had carbon monoxide poisoning or something that's so bright red. She had a temperature of 104. Her throat looked awful. And she had a condition, a very technical condition that we nurses call floppy. She couldn't hold her head up. She was just completely listless. And so I sent her to the emergency room. And then it was still, not even breakfast time yet. So I changed my clothes and I went and got in the breakfast line. Oops. And the I should explain that Salvation Army had a contract with us for 3 months at a time to supply the food, but the Southern Baptist Convention had volunteers that actually served the food. So I went through the breakfast line, and it must have been even numbered day because we had protein that day. So I don't know if you've ever seen these things. Um, the brand we had was actually PBJ Jamwich or PB Jamwich, which had, I'm thinking, I don't know, 12 or 15 grams of protein in it. And these are just beautiful. It's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich without the crust. It's perfect. And then the other thing we had was these protein bars. The protein bars have a very thin layer of chocolate on the outside, and then the inside is compressed sawdust. And they have, I think it's 19 or 21 grams of protein. So this is what we got on even numbered days. But I got to the end of the line, and there was no coffee there. And I asked if there was any coffee in the dining room, and they said no. And I started to feel a little panicky. And I said, well, is there any place in the building where you might have coffee, or like where I could make coffee or something? And these Southern Baptists said, no, we don't drink coffee. And I thought, what is wrong with you people? And I didn't say that. But then I also thought, how am I going to stay here for 3 weeks? There's no way. I can't even make it for 3 days. I don't even know if I can make it till lunchtime without coffee. And I must have looked a little bit stricken because the wife turned to her husband and said, honey, where was that place where we had those scrambled eggs the other day? And he said, oh, Tony's Burritos, just right down at the end of the block. And you can actually see Casa del Refugiado behind Tony's. So it was about a half a block away. That's how big our lot was. But Tony's was adjacent to us. So I thought, well, any place that has scrambled eggs must have coffee. So I went to Tony's to look for coffee. It was the worst coffee I've ever had in my life. It shouldn't even be called coffee, but it was black and it was hot and it was liquid. And I thought, well, I can pretend this is coffee. I can stay for 3 weeks. This is going to be okay. Tony's had the worst coffee ever, but they had really, really, really good food. And it was very reasonable. And they had such a menu, such an extensive selection that I ate there for 19 days in a row. Never had the same thing twice and never got through even half their menu, I don't think. And the reason I'm dwelling so much on Tony's, for several reasons. They were very good to me personally. They were very kind to me personally. But they were also very generous and very compassionate with the refugees. And I think to some extent they did some good promotion for Casa del Refugiado in the neighborhood. I think they did some good PR work for us as far as neighborhood attitudes. And the other thing about Tony's is that we didn't have Wi-Fi in CDR. So the only place you could get news was next door at Tony's. They had this big flat screen TV, which was always muted on one wall, but I could, down at the bottom there, I could read some of the crawl sometimes. That was a morning news station that they always had on from Ciudad Juarez across the river. And then on the other wall, on the opposite wall, they had a radio, which was also always tuned to a news station, Ciudad Juarez. And so I could hear what was going on in the world and what was going on in our region. One morning, I happened to hear the mayor of Ciudad Juarez saying, Mr. Trump, you got to help us out here. You've got to do something about this situation. We've got 25,000 extra people. We don't know what to do with them. We don't have sanitation for them. We don't have a place to shelter them. We don't have any kind of, law enforcement or administrative people to handle this influx. Mr. Trump, you've got to do something for us. So it was a way to catch up on news. So that was the end of my first 24 hours with Annunciation House, but you came here to hear about people who had traveled a lot farther than I did. The people that we served came, I would say 98% of them came from Central America, 3 countries which are known as the Northern Triangle: Guatemala, El Salvador and Honduras. They left their homes. They left behind everything that was familiar. They left most of their family. They left whatever kind of housing they had. They left their jobs. They left, in many cases, their language. They left their holidays, their traditions, their culture, because they couldn't live there anymore. The gangs have taken over in El Salvador and Honduras, um, commit all manner of crimes, especially extortion. They take rent from houses and from businesses in exchange for protection. They do drug smuggling. I am just learning recently that they do a lot of gun running from the United States, um, prostitution, anything you can imagine. Um, but the worst thing is that the gangs recruit young people very forcefully. They recruit young boys to be members of the gang and to commit all those crimes, to, be sentries while they're committing murder, to store stolen goods, to run messages, and then eventually to learn how to do all the gang activities. They recruit the young girls, the adolescent girls, to be gang members' girlfriends, and you can just imagine what that involves. So conditions are not such that they can live there anymore. Additionally, Honduras has recently had a couple of hurricanes. They haven't been able to recover from those at all. Salvador and Honduras compete, or if you want to call it that, every year for which one of them is the murder capital of the world. Sometimes El Salvador will be number one and Honduras number two, and sometimes they'll, switch back and forth. But it's conditions are just really unlivable for many people. Guatemala is a little bit different story. Many of the people who came to us were farmers. Many of them, great majority, I guess I would say, were indigenous people who have been persecuted by the government for decades, at least 40 years that I know of. There have been genocides. There have been thousands of people who have been disappeared. The small farmers, sometimes have everything taken from them, which is not much, but they may have a couple acres of land and farm corn on that, and that's taken from them. Or they may work in the coffee production and get fired from that, or lose their jobs. And additionally, at the time I went to El Paso, Guatemala had been under a state of drought for 2 or 3 years, so the farms were failing anyway. And so the poverty in Guatemala, well, in all those countries, but especially Guatemala, I think, is really crushing. And people, I mean, literally are having trouble finding anything to eat. And because they're indigenous people, many of them don't speak Spanish as a first language. They speak one of the 30 plus Mayan languages. And they probably, most of them, I'm guessing, are illiterate in any language. So just really no opportunity. So they set out for North America, which is roughly 2,300 miles away, depending on, where they leave from. Somewhere between 2,000, 2,500 miles. The people that I talked with had mostly traveled mostly by bus. I did meet one family that walked the entire distance, mother, father, and little girl. But most of the people rode buses. And if you think about a bus, you think, well, that's not really that bad. But buses in Mexico and Central America typically are American school buses, like from the 1970s, that have been refurbished and now serve as public transportation. So no seat belts, no cushions, no springs, no air conditioning. Maybe the windows will go up and down, maybe they won't. Very likely you'll be sharing the bus with some produce or some livestock. That's not at all unfamiliar, not at all unusual. They would traveled by bus as far as they could, and if they got to a place where they couldn't make a connection, then they would either walk for a ways or hitch a ride, like in a pickup truck, something like that. That phase of the journey took them on average about 15 days, 15 days to go 2,300 miles. They ate whatever they could find, whatever they could afford, usually a tortilla and maybe some beans or some rice. They would tell me that they could afford one bottle of something a day, either Coca-Cola or water, and that was it. I didn't realize, it never dawned on me, that Central Americans can't eat Mexican food. It's either too spicy for them, or sometimes I think they would say to me too greasy, but they just couldn't tolerate Mexican food. Sometimes I had been in Mexico 2 months earlier in March of 2019. And I think at that time, Mexicans were favorably disposed to these immigrants, and they would come to the bus stations and bring tortillas and fruit and bottles of water and sometimes rice and beans and things like that, tacos. But by already a couple months later, by May of 2019, I think, Mexico, and certainly now it must be much worse. Mexico was suffering some compassion fatigue because thousands and tens of thousands of people were coming through. So I suppose that they slept on the bus when they could. When they got to a new town, they would sleep, on the ground. And they were victims sometimes of assaults and robberies on the way. Didn't have much to rob, but it was a very difficult time for them for that 2 weeks, 15, 17 days sometimes. Then they would get to a place like this, which is an approved border post, an approved port of entry. El Paso has 4 or 5 ports of entry, approved ports of entry, but this one is 27 miles west in Santa Teresa, New Mexico. And this is where all the refugees came to us from this port of entry. Not sure how or why, but they would surrender themselves when they got to a place like this. That's the legal term. They would petition for asylum. They would surrender themselves and say that they were refugees seeking shelter, seeking a safe harbor. And then the Border Patrol would apprehend them. And that's also a legal term, which in my mind has the connotation of criminal activity. So they would surrender themselves, and then they would get apprehended on thus and such day at thus and such time at Santa Teresa, New Mexico. They would then be put into detention on average for, it was almost always 5 days and 4 nights. And every single 100% of the people I talked to about detention, every single one, used exactly the same phrase. They treated us like animals. Sometimes they would expand a little and they'd say, they could never treat livestock like that, or they treated us worse than dogs, but it was always they treated us like animals. And while they were in detention, what was happening is that law enforcement of some kind, and I heard crazy rumors. I heard that there were 14 agencies. I heard that there were 7 agencies. I heard there were 4, including Interpol and I don't know who, but I'm sure it was FBI and someone from Homeland Security would be investigating them, vetting them, investigating their backgrounds, looking for criminal activity, and then also vetting their sponsors. So all the people that we saw had some relative in the United States, brother or mother or uncle or sister-in-law. And it could be anywhere from Maine. I think I saw some from Maine and New Hampshire to San Diego, to Cleveland, Wisconsin, Nashville, just all over. Lots of places in Florida, Alabama, Georgia. So they had some relative who was willing to receive them. And so the Border Patrol and the other agencies were investigating the refugees themselves and then also their sponsors. And when they had verified that their papers were in order, no, I got to back up a little bit. When they went into detention, they the first thing that was confiscated from them was their phones, their cell phones, and their cell phone chargers. The next thing that was confiscated was all their belts and shoestrings and shoelaces. The next thing was every medication that they had, whether it be over the counter or prescription. And then generally the last thing that was confiscated was any clothing that they had extra. So at that point, they were left with just the clothes on their backs and each other. In some rare cases, I think I only saw this 3 or 4 times, they confiscated jewelry from them. And then maybe in half a dozen cases, they confiscated all their documentation, took their passports, their birth certificates, if they had a marriage license or anything like that, took all their documents from them. So when they went into detention for that 4 or 5 days, all those things were confiscated. No medication, no extra clothes, no change of clothes, no cell phones. And then they were there for 4 nights, 5 days. I don't know what the food and drink situation was in detention. I never really heard from them what they got. I think it was pretty meager. I don't know what they had in the way of sanitation facilities, but I think they were probably also very substandard. Yeah, so you can imagine 4 days and 5 nights with not very much to eat, no change of clothes. And then the other thing I said to one of the families, I understood that they slept on the ground, that they slept on a concrete floor. And I asked one of the families about that, and they said, no, we couldn't sleep on a concrete floor. There wasn't enough room. Half of us could lie down, and the other half had to stand all night and all day. And then we would change places every once in a while. So if you can imagine, 4 days without even being able to sit down and stretch out. So when they had done the vetting process, they would come to us. Experienced Border Patrol drivers would bring them to the back door of that huge building that you saw. They would come either in vans or buses, anywhere from, I think the smallest group I saw was 25, and maybe the biggest group was 85 in a couple of buses. Sometimes, like, I want to say there were 25 in a regular van that, had capacity for 13. So they would come to the back door and sometimes announced, sometimes they would call ahead and say, I'm bringing you 55 people, or sometimes they would just show up. And if they just showed up, this is my vantage point from the clinic. This, you can see this bright spot in the back there. That's the back door where they would enter. So the Border Patrol agent would come through there and he'd walk over towards me. And that would be my first inkling that new arrivals had come. And he would get to this clinic where there was a very white person who looked like she probably spoke English. And he would say to me, are you in charge here? I'd say, no, I would laugh and laugh. And I'd say, no, I'm not, but I will run and get somebody who is. So what I really would do is run and get the letter cards. And then I would try to round up as much help as I could, find some other volunteers and tell them that we had new arrivals. So this is part of the genius of the system of the shelter. We had sections in the dormitory we had 8 sections in the dormitory from A through H. A and B was for mothers with daughters. C and D was for mothers with sons. E was for fathers with daughters. F was for fathers with sons. And G and H were for family groups, mother, father, and 2 kids, mother and 3 kids, whatever it would be. And we would take them, we'd let them get off the buses and let them use the porta potties. And then we would line them up on that back porch from in those groups. So I'd have, mothers and daughters on the right, and then whole families on the left. We'd have about 5 lines, and we'd hand each person a card. Even infants, we'd have a card for them. And so that would show them where they were going to sleep. And it was also their ticket to the clothing bank. Everybody got one trip to the clothing bank while they stayed with us. And here's the other beauty of the system. They only stayed with us for, on average, about 48 to 72 hours. And then we had them off to their sponsors. It's a beautiful, beautifully designed system. Anyway, so I would be on the back porch, and we'd give them a little welcome talk. Did they get their belongings back? Okay, good question. So they got their cell phones back. I think in every case, I didn't know of anybody that ever didn't get a cell phone back. About half of them got their cell phone chargers back. I don't know, maybe more than half. They never got their prescriptions back, never got any of their medications back, never got any of their clothes back, never got any shoestrings. They would come to us with, the tongues of their shoes flopping. They did get their, I only saw those 3 cases, I think, where they had jewelry that was taken. And in those cases, they had like a little claim ticket. They would present that when they got to us, and we would take the claim ticket and give them their jewelry. And they never did get their documents back. They did not get their passports back, which I can't fathom that. In exchange for their birth certificate and their passport, they would get a little flimsy slip of paper from, I guess, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, saying their name, their birth date, and their country of origin or something like that. And that was it. Anyway, so we would do a little welcome talk, and we would explain to them that meals were at 8 and noon and 5. And we would tell them that they were free to walk around. They, could go anywhere they wanted, but in case we needed to reach them, if we had a phone call for them or something, if they could stay kind of close. But the main rule was that parents and kids always had to stay together. We couldn't have any unsupervised kids running around. That was the key thing, that parents and kids always had to be within reach of each other. There were a couple other rules too. They should not take any food back to their dormitories, back out of the dining hall, and they should not be barefoot. I think that was it. Oh, and we told him that there would be lights out at 10 o'clock at night. We just tried to start getting things quiet at 9:30 at night, try to get the kids down for bed. I think that's about it. Any other questions before I go on? Okay, thanks for that one. And then we would bring them in to the intake room, I guess I would call it. Seat them in family groups and kind of, put them in order. Oh, good question. How did you communicate with the different languages they spoke? So for the most part, almost all the refugees, 98% of them, spoke Spanish in some form. So we could speak Spanish with them. The people that spoke the Mayan languages, generally those would be like middle-aged adults or little kids. And I hadn't even heard of some of these languages. Mam, Kekchi were some of the common ones. Mom was very common. So usually they would have maybe like an adult child, like a 20-year-old child that could interpret for them. And then the little kids, of course, they spoke with their parents. So as long as somebody in the group could speak Spanish, we could get along. Before I went to El Paso, when I applied, and then when I arrived, I had them ask me a couple of times, do you speak any other languages besides Spanish? And I said, well, yeah, I mean, I speak Portuguese. And they said, oh, that's terrific. That's fantastic. And I thought, really? Because, like, do you have people walking up here from Brazil? I couldn't understand why Portuguese would be so important, but I would say, I don't know how many Portuguese speakers how many Brazilians? I'd say maybe I saw 50 or 75 Brazilian families in the time I was there. Brazilian families, we can talk about that a little bit later if there's time, but um, it was interesting. They all came, all save one family, came from a state in Brazil, the central west region of Brazil called Minas Gerais, Central Mines. And they were all economic refugees. They were not being persecuted, any of them. But they would say that they came here for the same reasons that, like, my ancestors came, and maybe some of yours. They came to seek more opportunity and have a better life for themselves and their kids. They would say they couldn't find jobs in Brazil, or the wages were really low, or taxes were high. And one man, I said, you know, why did you give up so much and go through all these hardships to come here? And he said, because I would never be able to afford a house in Brazil. I said, really? You want to buy a house, and that's what motivated you to leave? And he said, yep. So it so happened that I spoke the same dialect. My Brazilian family was from Minas Gerais too. So I spoke their dialect, and I could make little jokes with them and stuff. So that worked out well. As far as I know, there were only 2 Portuguese speakers in all of El Paso, me and this nun. But anyway, some of the Brazilians would say, it's okay, I can understand some Spanish. Sometimes they could. Um, and some of our Spanish speaking volunteers, you know, could kind of put a few words together for them. So it worked out. We didn't ever have anybody that we couldn't communicate with, I don't think. Um, some dialects of Spanish are really, like, for me to understand Cubans, I would ask them over and over to slow down and repeat. And, you know, I speak Mexican more than Cuban, but anyway. So we would bring them into this area. We'd have them line up according to family groups, and we'd call them up, and we'd have them, this is what we needed the volunteers for. And I'd go running around, you know, finding people that could come and work the intake room. And if you were doing something else, and if you spoke Spanish, you were supposed to drop what you were doing and come in and receive these people. And I'm sorry, this form is not clear. I did not take this picture. Up on the top, we had to keep very careful, pay very careful attention to everybody's names in the group that was traveling, and their birth date, and their relationship to each other. And because it's a Latino culture, we started with the father. Father always came first. Um, and then did I say country of origin over here at the right? And then down here on the bottom, this is really key. This is their sponsors. This is their sponsors information. So sponsors name and relationship to them, and address and phone number. And everybody that came to us, had about 5 or 6 sheets of paper that they had gotten when they left detention. And for me, there was only one key page that I always had to go to, and that was the sponsors information. And I would verify what I had on my 5 sheets of paper with whatever information the family had. And I want to show you, one time, somebody who had made this 20-day journey through rivers and mountains and rainforests and sleeping on the ground and who knows what, pulled out a little scrap of a napkin from his pocket, just like I'm doing now. And I thought, how did you have this piece of paper for 20 days through all that? And it had his brother's phone number on it. And so that's, you know, what we were working with. Sometimes the little scrap of paper, a couple of times, the little scrap of paper they had, we couldn't tell if it was an 8 or a 3 or a 5 or something. And if this is your one connection to the outside world, we just had to get these things right. I saw a few miracles in those cases. Then this other block in the middle here, these last two blocks sometimes got very delicate. The middle one was anybody in your party separated from you at the border or anywhere along the journey? And then the one on the right is anybody in your family sick? Have any symptoms? So we would go through, we would get all that. And then this is a really key piece of paper. This is their transportation card. So again, we had to write down everybody that was in the traveling group together, their names and their ages. And then they would either be going by bus or by air. And then we had to know who was their sponsor, who was going to pay for the ticket for them. And then we would, once we had done that intake, then we would move them over. I'm not getting my, oh, there. So these are people filling out those forms, and then we would move them over to the other side of the room. Note the artwork there. And they would wait for their name to be called so they could go into the room where it happens. These are the rooms where we made the phone calls to their sponsors. We had about, I think, 6, maybe 8, I don't know, cell phones that belonged to Casa del Refugiado. They were the only ones that we would use. And we would call their sponsor. We were on Mountain Time, right? We were on Mountain Time. So we were 2 hours earlier than the East Coast and an hour later than the West Coast. And we called from 10 in the morning until 10 at night. And we would call these sponsors in, Boston or Nashville or San Diego or wherever it was. And I'd say, I've got Rodolfo Flores here with his family. I'm in El Paso, Texas. And we want to know if you can please buy a bus ticket or a plane ticket for the family. And the brother-in-law or the uncle or whoever it was on the other end of the line invariably said, yes, I can do that. It was just amazing to me that the answer was always yes. And they were expecting the call, of course. And then I would let them talk to the people, the refugees, for a few minutes. And I always expected a lot of drama. I thought there would be tears and shouts and, all kinds of exclamations. And there never was. It was always business. They'd say, yep, we're here. Yep. What's the name of this city again? Because, they'd been in detention. They had no idea where they were. And we would always stress that it was El Paso, Texas. You need to buy a ticket for them sometime that's leaving sometime between 10 in the morning and 10 at night. And it cannot be an open-ended ticket. It must be a ticket with a certain date and time. And then we're going to need you to call back on one of these phones, this phone number that I'm going to give you. You can only call on this phone. You can't call on a personal cell phone. You must call us on this phone and give us the confirmation number. And they'd say, okay. So that was their connection to the outside world. And then we would welcome them into the shelter. We would take them to the hygiene room. Everybody who came got a little face size washcloth, face towel. Everybody got their own toothbrush. And then sometimes, depending on what we had for supplies, everybody got some kind of shampoo, some kind of soap. Men got they got razors and shaving gel. Women got feminine supplies, and sometimes we had deodorant we could give them, but not often. Sometimes they had, family size things that they had to share. All these things had been donated one way or another. And you can see the I think you can see all the sizes of diapers that we had. And I think we had a couple of different kinds of infant formula. And then we had what everybody wanted, what everybody needed. We had shoelaces. And then when we ran out of shoelaces, we made our own. And then everybody was issued a Red Cross blanket. They could borrow them. They were not to take them with them. And we would take them down into the dormitory, and the code was if the cots were flipped up on their sides like that, they were available. They were vacant. If they were down on the floor like this, then they were occupied, obviously. When the refugees would first come in, when they would be new arrivals, we would take them from the back door through the dormitory here, and that this box that you're seeing in the middle was called the tree house. There was always somebody sleeping in there at night, always kind of an on-call person, ideally somebody who spoke Spanish to cover any medical emergencies or any other kind of emergencies. And then they would go to their designated section of the dormitory, A, B, C, D, E, F, or G. Esperanza was section F. That means hope. It's one of our beautiful murals. And by the way, before I forget, if anybody wants to look up the New York Times on Thursday, April 8th, had a feature about the murals, and it had one of our artists, one of our muralists has his work in there, and it was all about the murals of El Paso. But and then once the people were settled in, we started trying to the sponsors would call us. So this is the office, and you can see a couple of the phones there and a volunteer. So people would call us back as soon as they had bought the plane ticket or the bus ticket. They would call us with the confirmation number. And then we would move them over to the departures board. Sometimes we would have, sometimes it was pretty chaotic in the office. We'd have like 5 people answering phones. Sometimes like this apparent time we had 1 person answering 4 phones. I don't know how they juggled all that. They would put people on hold and get those confirmation numbers. So on the left, we had phone calls that had been made. They were pending, and we were waiting for the families to call us back. And then on the right side, we had the departures that were already confirmed. And you can see from here, we had, I think we had 5 shuttles every day from the shelter that went to various bus stations. And I think, were there 3 bus lines? There was Tornado, Greyhound, and Trailways, I think. And then we had a couple of shuttles every day over to the airport at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., I think. So if you had a, let's say a 2 p.m. flight, you would have to take the 10 a.m. shuttle over to the airport and just wait there. Same thing with the buses. I don't think they had quite as much wait time, but a lot of times people would have to go and sit and wait. And there were airport ladies, a couple of volunteers who would get to the airport every morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they'd stay till who knows when, I don't know, 8 o'clock in the evening, I think, and make sure that people were getting to their gates. And then, I don't know if you saw, there was a little laptop computer in that last picture. We would enter the confirmation dates and times, the travel dates. And then people would go, mostly men, I think, would go into the screen room here and sit and wait for their name to show up, that they had been confirmed that they had a ticket to go. And then there was this map on the wall. And I thought, at first I thought it was like for decoration. Oh, good question, Ruth. First I thought that if they, it was for decoration, or it would be like, we having an American flag in the room or something. But then I realized these people had no idea where they were. They were way over here in the west of Texas, and maybe they were going to some place called Birmingham, Alabama, or maybe they were going to Boston or Cleveland, Wisconsin, and they had no idea, where any of these places were, what these, names of states were, or anything. So there would always be like 2 or 3 people clustered around this map, trying to, figure out where they were and where they were going. So the question is, what if they didn't have a sponsor? Everybody had a sponsor. That's the rules of the game. That's what they were doing in detention, when they were in detention for 4 nights and 5 days, treated like animals. They were waiting for their sponsor to be vetted. And if they didn't have a sponsor, they wouldn't come to us. They would just get straight away deported. If you didn't have a sponsor, I don't think you would even maybe go into detention. I think, well, maybe you would, or maybe you would just get deported right away. How did they deal without having ID for flights? Yeah, well, that was a big problem. They had this little sheet of paper that they had been issued, and I guess that must have worked. That is a very good question. And as I say, I only saw like, I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Um, Chris is a, I should introduce, can you wave? Um, Chris is from West Bend, Wisconsin, and she had been listening to public radio one time and heard a story about Annunciation House, and she went down there. Annunciation House was brand new. They had just opened it up about April 15th. I got there in May, and Chris got there earlier than I did, so she broke in the place. Chris is saying that the airport people were familiar with our people that we would bring over to them. Yeah, connecting flights would have been a big problem too. I don't know what they did. Yeah, I get. Yeah. And the only really big problem I ever had when I was in El Paso with security was the day I left, there was a woman whose flight was like at 9:45, and we didn't get there until 9 o'clock or something. We came on a van with Krista was driving, I was there, and there must have been 13 other people in the van, I think. And Krista said, "This woman's running late. You take her and shepherd her. I'll take care of the rest of them." And so I took her up to security, and the security agent, it was really hard to figure out what line we should get in. We got in the line. There was nobody stationed where we were supposed to be waiting, and so I went and got in a different line with her. They sent us back to the place where there wasn't anybody. Finally, an agent came and got really harsh with me about how come I was there with such short notice. What was I thinking, bringing somebody when her flight was only 45 minutes away, and they were already boarding. And so I don't know how somebody would have dealt with that without an advocate. I was there to speak for her, but I don't know. So they did have that little flimsy slip of paper, and then they did have a kind of a voucher for the planes. For the buses, they actually had a ticket. Um, and then some of the other services that we offered them while they were there, while they were waiting. I think this was called maybe the nutrition room, but I called it the peanut butter room. We made okay, I made like 85 peanut butter sandwiches in the time I was there. There were people who made tens of thousands of peanut butter sandwiches, I'm sure. How many did you make? Not that many? Okay. Several days worth. Um, So we would send them when they were going to go on the bus or go on a plane. We would send them with a little care package. My friend Julia, she's a nurse, but she didn't speak Spanish, and so she was really like the captain of the peanut butter team. I would guess she made tens of thousands of them, of sandwiches. Oh, okay. Thanks for the question. I'll get to that in a minute. Um, and there were nuns that came from various orders all over the United States, and they would come and often go to the peanut butter room or the clothing bank. We would put the peanut butter sandwiches in groups. I don't know if it was bags of 8 or bags of 10 when we had them. And then everybody that was going to travel got a care package. Long bus and short bus doesn't refer to the bus, but to the bus ride. Short bus is anywhere within Texas or maybe even as far as California. Long bus is if they were going to be on the bus for a couple of days. It was like one day to Dallas and then another day to Birmingham. And the contents of the care package, they would have some snacks, and then they would have this really key piece of paper, this little slip of paper with them that is written in English, and we would direct them, show people, help me find my bus, help me find my airplane gate. Yeah, so people that were traveling on a short bus route or a long bus route, no liquids, and everybody had to have that note. And then at departure time, somebody would go with a bullhorn into the dormitory and announce the names at 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock, I don't know, whatever all the times were, call the names of all the people that were supposed to be leaving. And then we would take the provisions to the back door. Always had to have plenty of diapers and formula ready for people that were traveling with little kids. The city of El Paso had these like courtesy shuttles, I think for, maybe disabled people and stuff, but they would give them to us sometimes, let us use them for shuttling to airports, and not so much airport, but bus stations. Goodbyes. You can see how people, everything they owned is in those tote bags. So a question came from being a nurse and being, which they didn't need a nurse, right? Being multilingual, some of the skills, man, I don't know. I have been a camp nurse since forever. And I think learning how to work with limited resources and kind of muddle through circumstances when everything wasn't, kind of by the book, I guess helped. We I want to take just a few minutes. Chris, can I call you up, put you on the spot to sit in this chair? Chris doesn't, or at least when she went to El Paso, she didn't speak any Spanish.
Put the headset on so they can hear you.
Oh, put the headset on. Actually, they don't. Oh, they have to. Chris, give somebody some shaving cream. Okay, now give him some shampoo. Okay, now give him some deodorant. So this is skills that people didn't even know they had when they got there. But it worked, right? Yeah, Chris was like the queen of the hygiene room. Yeah, so people discovered skills. And I think that's the thing that I most discovered when I was there. We were such a team. My big fear when I went there was that we would have an outbreak of chickenpox or an outbreak of measles. Didn't see any measles at all. Did see a couple of kids with chickenpox. And because we had people that would move furniture at 10:30 on a Saturday night, and people who would go to the clothing bank and look for a long sleeve shirt for a Salvadoran 3-year-old at 10:30 at night, we made it work. So it took a whole village. Um, this is just our census report for the day. You can see that we had 478 sleeping overnight. So we were pretty close to our capacity of 500 at that point. Sometimes the Salvation Army cook would come to me like at, I don't know, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 o'clock in the afternoon and say, Peggy, how many people do you think we're going to have for supper tonight? I would just laugh and laugh and laugh because, who knew what Border Patrol was going to bring us? Could be 3 buses or it could be nobody. I mean, we had never had any clue. This is a list of all the things that had to happen every day. And you can imagine, I mean, it just took tons of people to do those things. So this is the Salvation Army kitchen. This is where all the food was prepared. And you could tell the Salvation Army people, they always wore the black uniforms. And then the Southern Baptist volunteers wore the yellow uniforms. And those groups would each stay for a week and rotate out. This was our serving line. So at 8, 12, and 5, people would line up outside and get their plates served up to them. It's our dining room. And you can see that even in the dining room, there was beautiful artwork, beautiful murals. We had high chairs available. I don't think I ever saw them being used. I don't think Latino people tend to keep their little kids on their laps. We did have an auxiliary dining room, and when we got up to 480 people, when we got close to our capacity, we moved into there just to give people a little more space. And then after almost every meal, I think some of the refugees, and keep in mind that they only stayed there for like 48 hours. So they didn't kind of get used to where they were or anything, but somebody would almost always come up to us and say, can I have a broom? Can I get some cleaning rags? Can I help clean up? Because they just, wanted to serve. This is the shower unit, I guess also from Salvation Army. I never got in there. It had a special key. Chris was also in there sometimes cleaning up and restocking, and I think it got pretty skanky. But yeah, considering the number, Chris says, considering the number of people that went through it, everybody was kind of promised that they would get a shower during the time that they stayed with us during that 48 hours after, 20 days of traveling and 4 or 5 days of maybe sleeping on the ground or maybe standing up in the same clothes. And then everybody was promised that they had their letter ticket, their letter card. Everybody was promised that they would get a trip to the clothing bank. And the way it was supposed to work is everybody was promised that they got a pair of clean underwear and a pair of clean socks. And anything beyond that was gravy. If they could find a shirt or pants that fit, so much the better. But we promised them that they would all get clean underwear and socks. And of course, shoes were like just worth their weight in gold. I had a couple of several men that came up to me and asked if I could give them some duct tape or some glue. And I said, the first time I said, no, I don't think I'll look for some. Why do you need it? Because their shoes were literally falling off. The upper had come loose from the sole and it was just flapping, and so shoes were really at a premium. And the other thing, of course, were those tote bags or backpacks to carry their meager possessions. The entire time I was there, I only saw 3 ankle bracelets. One was on kind of an elderly lady, one was on a youth, and one was on a man um, with very disturbed with PTSD. Um, while they were there, they would take advantage of, the men would be in the monitor room, in the screen room, watching to see when their bus ticket was or their plane ticket. And the women would be taking care of kids and washing clothes. And they would wash clothes wherever they could find a hose or a sink or whatever and dry them in the open air. Some people wanted to those skanky clothes that they had been wearing for a week. They wanted to throw them away and just never see them again and kind of put that chapter of their lives behind them, I think. And some people would actually wash their clothes and dry them and fold them and hand them to me and say, this is for the next person who comes along. Um, this is our where the volunteers entered, and this was our donation room. And you can see, so keep in mind, this was May. Could have been, I don't know, Mother's Day or Memorial Day, whatever. But we've got some things that we really don't need. And then some things that we really could use. We got diapers, those toys that you see down there at the bottom. Um, we moved those back into the children's play area and they got so much use. They were a delight. We got the diapers and then like, I don't know what people were thinking. Um, right. Right. But why they thought they would be useful for us, I'm not sure. um, and sometimes people would drop off. I mean, I don't think anybody could understand what was going on there. Sometimes people would drop off like a can of peas or something like that. But we had cases of Pedialyte and cases of children's Tylenol and all kinds of things that we could really use. You can see pull-ups over there in the corner. We needed stuff like that. If people brought clothing, and they often did, it was way too big for the Central Americans. Americans are just taller and wider than Central Americans. Yeah, but they would bring us formula and stuff. After I had been there like 2 or 3 days, people would come up to me all the time, and they were sick. They had this symptom or that symptom, and I would take them in the clinic and take care of them. And then people would line up outside, because they saw the lights on in the clinic. And so finally, I realized I have to set up kind of a schedule here. Um, and so I thought these people have nothing that they can count on. They have nothing that's predictable. They have nothing that's certain. So I am going to open the clinic every morning at 10 o'clock and let them know that. And it was such a relief to them, I think, and it was such a relief to me to know that there would be somebody there every morning at 10 o'clock. The only problem I had with this was, with this little system of mine, was that I was surprised at the number of adults that had motion sickness. And so if they had to get on a 10 o'clock bus or a 10 o'clock plane, um, uh, opening the clinic at 10 didn't help them too much. So they would come and find me and I would run in and get them some Dramamine or whatever we had. Um, Remind me about that question. Ruth is asking where we can donate. Before we close, I can actually get you an address. Thank you. That's very kind of you. So this is my bailiwick. This is my wheelhouse. This is our little clinic. Um, there were lots of people that helped in the clinic. Anybody that spoke Spanish and could, read labels could hand out Tylenol to people, just like if you would do if you were a mom at home. And there was a retired nurse who was fully bilingual who would come every Friday. And at one point she said to me, Peggy, let's divide the room in half. we can see twice as many patients. So each of us would put a patient in one of these chairs and attend to them. Everything we had was donated, and I could make a wish list of what I most needed. Always needed Tylenol and always needed Pedialyte. This is the generic version of Pedialyte, which is sold at Walmart, and I used it on adults and kids alike. Couldn't have gotten along without that. And I learned these kids had been through all kinds of trauma, all kinds of hardship. And so I quickly learned that if I gave them, you know, the child who was sick and then all the siblings and, you know, whoever was in there with me, a sticker, let them choose a sticker, everything would go much smoother. We developed a little trusting relationship, and then they would open their mouths for me and let me look in their ears and stuff like that. So those two items were my stock in trade. I had lots of days where I would line up, before I turned the lights on in the clinic, I would sneak in there and I would line up about 20 little medicine cups. I would put adult Tylenol in 10 of the cups, and I would put an adult dose of cough syrup in 10 of the cups. It saved me a little time because we just, we had a ton of flu symptoms. I realized the day that I got there, another nurse helped us figure this out, that we had an outbreak of strep. And so that little girl that first little girl that I saw, the 4-year-old, she was treated for strep, but there were lots of adults with strep too. And the beauty was we had some doctors that kind of would show up randomly. I never knew when they were coming. But we had some pediatricians who were just wonderful. They were used to working after Hurricane Katrina and in Haiti and places like that. And so they were used to working with man-made and human-made disasters. And they would just kind of show up for 2 or 3 days, which was a huge help. And they spoke Spanish too. But then there was another man who I met shortly after I arrived. He was a pediatrician on the faculty of University of Texas, El Paso. And he said, Peggy, anything you need, you call me. If you're sick, if you have any symptoms that need treatment, you call me. If any of the volunteers are sick or need help, you call me. And if any of the refugees are sick, you call me. So the beauty of technology is I could send him a picture on my cell phone, and he would write right back and say, you know, yes, this is measles. No, this is chickenpox, you know, whatever. And we did have 2 cases of chickenpox while I was there. This is Marvin. He's 3 years old. And I am happy to say that I was way ahead of the curve with the masks. I took a few kids masks and a few adult masks down there when I went because I didn't know what I was going to find long before it was cool to wear a mask. And I had to take this picture of Marvin because he thought he was drowning. He thought he couldn't see anything if he wore a mask. So I had to show him that he was okay. And like I say, it took a village, and we kept him isolated, and we didn't have any outbreaks. So that's the story. If you have more questions, type them in. I'm going to run and get that address for you real quick. And I'm guessing maybe we could even post this on the library website. I don't know. Okay. So it's Annunciation House, and there's a post office box. Watch for that on the video, or can I type it in now? Okay. Type message here. I'm not getting there. Oh, okay. Yeah. No, we're done. We're good. Any other questions? Oh, okay. I'm not there though. It's not doing anything.
It's 'cause you have to hit it to make it go over there.
What?
So you have 8 and then 8.
Oh, I'm not seeing it. Okay. Yeah, right. I can type. Okay, now the zip I gotta get right.
That's 7, 9, 5, that's 1, 1, 8, 9.
Okay. Oh. Yeah, you can kind of read that, right? Yeah, you would make a check out to Annunciation House. Yeah, that would be great. And if you think that you might like to volunteer down there, they just recently started February 26th. They were kind of closed, with COVID and then with the Remain in Mexico policy. That's a whole other issue. But so Casa del Refugiado was virtually closed for a while. But on February 26th, they took in their first 25 guests. And then a week later, they had 50. And now I understand they're up to like 125. So Casa del Refugiado is as big as a Costco. It's 90,000 square feet, I think. So like 90 times the size of my house. So they can distance everybody. I don't know how they would work the food service and that kind of thing. And I don't know I don't know if they've improved the sanitation, if they have, running water in there now, but how does my experience compare to today? Well, it's so different. Obviously because of COVID. We gave out a lot of hugs. A lot of people cried on my shoulder. Um, you know, uh, those, I don't know, those things would be so different now, of course. And nobody was wearing masks back then except the chickenpox kid. But so COVID, changed everything. But when I was there, conditions in those Northern Triangle countries were very bad, and people were fleeing. But they could seek asylum. They could, present themselves at a port of entry and say that they were requesting asylum. Um, the the MPP, Migration Protection Policy, better known as Remain in Mexico, was already starting to be in place when I was there. It started on the west side. It started in San Diego, Tijuana, and it moved, it rolled like a wave eastward. So it started, I think, in January, February in Tijuana in 2019. And then by the time I was in El Paso, we still didn't have the Remain in Mexico policy. That wasn't put in place till maybe like September, October. And then it moved further eastward to like Brownsville. And so what that meant was people had to stay on the Mexican side of the border and wait to be called. So instead of having 500 people a day come to Annunciation House or come to Casa del Refugiado, the judges and the courts would call as many people as they could handle in one day. So it might be 2 or 3, might be as many as 20. So all those other 500 people that didn't get to cross the border, didn't even get to go into detention, they stayed on the Mexican side. So right now we think there are something upwards of 35,000 people on the Mexican side in Ciudad Juarez waiting for their chance to come over and have an immigration hearing. So that's the huge thing that changed, is that we weren't letting anybody across the border. And then, of course, there was something called Title 42 when COVID hit, that we weren't allowing anybody across the border for those reasons, for public health reasons. And those people that lived on the Ciudad Juarez side, some of them have been waiting now for 2 years. They've been living in tents or under like little tarps for 2 years, waiting for their chance to get an immigration hearing. You can imagine how vulnerable they were. When we had that terrible cold snap here in February, they had that in El Paso too. And those people, if they did have a tent or a tarp, they had like icicles hanging off of their tarp. It was incredible. Some of them find jobs with food service or, food delivery or something, enough so that they can afford like a $2 mattress in the basement of a motel or something. You can imagine what that's like. A lot of them have been victims of all kinds of crime, robberies and assaults. There's a lot of kidnapping. And you wouldn't think that these are kidnap potential people, but if they find out that you have a sponsor in the United States, they will hold you for ransom, and your sponsor, has to pay. Or yeah, so conditions were very difficult when I was there, and they've gotten much worse. Oh yeah, I've got a great library story. Because we have a couple of library friends here. Thank you. I would have forgotten about that. This is a story I should have told the other night too, but I didn't think of it till yesterday. You'll remember I told you that we had a Guatemalan man who was very severely mentally and emotionally disturbed. And he had to spend, it was the Friday night before Mother's Day. He had to spend the entire night in the emergency room getting treatment because he was a danger to himself. And he had a little 6-year-old daughter who was just painfully shy. I don't know if she was shy or if she too had been traumatized, or, maybe just confused, but she really just could barely speak. And I have a feeling that her first language wasn't Spanish anyway. But so somebody needed to look after her while the dad was in the hospital. And it happened to be that I was on the treehouse duty that night. I was doing the on-call. And so she slept with me up in the treehouse that night. And then in the morning, we didn't still know what was going to happen with the dad, if he was going to be released or what was going to come of him. So it must have been an odd numbered day. So I took her down to the dining room and gave her some Cheerios, and man, did she dig into them. Oh my goodness, she loved her Cheerios. And then I thought, I need to keep her with me. I need to keep looking after her. So I pulled up a chair in the children's play area. And on that day, at that particular time, we had a lot of wonderful children's books in Spanish. Many of them were picture books and, books for younger kids. So I sat her on my lap and I just read book after book after book after book. And somebody asked about what other skills I have. I can do a wicked good rooster and dog sounds in Spanish. So I had her on my lap and we were reading all these stories, and you can imagine that we got kind of a little audience. And none of the other kids listened to a whole story, I don't think, but they would kind of wander in and listen for a while, and they'd get a toy and they'd go off and they'd come back and they'd listen for a while and then they'd go play with somebody else. And I thought, oh, this is so great. This is just such a beautiful thing. So we got her reunited with her dad, and they eventually ended up, their family came and picked them up from Denver. There were some miracles involved there too. But anyway, the following Monday mornings, the Monday after Mother's Day, I got on the phone with the El Paso Public Library. I called the main branch and I went through the automated system, and it shows the children's library. And I talked to a children's librarian, and explained to her where I was and who our guests were, our clients were. And she had heard of Annunciation House. She knew what was going on over there. I said, I know that this is a really busy time of year for you. You're gearing up for your summer read program and stuff, but we need some services over here. And she said, okay, good, we can do that. She didn't say, I have to think about it, or, I just don't know if we have time for that, or I have to ask my supervisor. She said, sure, we can do that. Call me back next week. We'll do some planning. We'll figure out what we can do. So I called her the next week and she said, we can do story time one morning a week. And I said, oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So, these kids needed everything. And that's one thing that the library could give them. And I don't know if you're reading the book, if you're reading Into the Beautiful North, but you see what a role that libraries play for people who need help in a strange place. So thank you all for coming. Any more questions? Thanks for staying. Bye-bye. Adiosito.